My name is Michael Carter. I am 37 years old, a captain in the United States Army. I have spent most of my adult life following orders, keeping my boots polished, and making sure the men under my command made it home. People think the military hardens you, but for me, it only made me value the quiet things more. The sound of my mother's voice when she called me her hero. The smell of her coffee on the mornings before deployment. She was everything steady in a world that kept moving. My father died when I was 12, and after that, it was just me and her against the world. Nancy Carter was not a woman who complained. She worked long hours at a diner in Kansas, saved every dollar, and sent me to basic training with a packed lunch and a letter that said, "Make me proud." She never remarried. She said some hearts only break once. When she got sick, I came home from deployment early, something I had never done in 15 years of service. The military hospital in Fort Riley was bright and sterile, full of machines that hummed like tired insects. I sat beside her bed every evening, talking about anything but the disease eating her lungs. She liked when I told her stories from overseas. I could see her smile even through the oxygen mask. I thought we were both pretending she would recover. That was the silent contract we had. Pretend long enough and maybe it becomes true. The night it happened, rain hit the window like static. I was watching the monitor next to her bed blink in slow rhythm when she reached for my hand. Her fingers were cold, almost weightless. I leaned closer, trying to hear her over the sound of the machines. She whispered my name. I said I was there. She looked straight at me, her eyes sharper than they had been in days. Then she said something that froze the air in my chest. "Michael, you are not my son." I thought she was confused, that the medication had blurred her mind. I told her to rest, but her grip tightened. She said she stole me, that she took me from a general's family when I was a baby. That my real name was not Michael Carter, that I was never hers. The monitor beeped faster as she tried to breathe. I wanted to tell her to stop, that none of this made sense. I wanted to call for the nurse, to push the confession back into silence. But she kept looking at me, her lips moving around the words she needed to say. I felt the floor tilt. My whole life cracked open in that small white room. Then the sound of the heart monitor turned into a flat line. I sat there for a long time, my hand still on hers, trying to understand if I had just lost my mother or if I had never truly had one. The rain outside kept falling, and the hallway smelled of antiseptic and rainwater. Nurses came in, did what they had to do, and left me with the shell of the only person I had ever trusted. I kept hearing her voice in my head. "You are not my son." I wanted to believe it was a dream, but the echo was too real. When they finally asked me to leave, I walked through the corridor without looking back. Soldiers saluted me out of habit, and I returned the gesture automatically, my mind somewhere else entirely. Outside, the rain soaked through my uniform. It felt like the world was washing something away, but I did not know what was left underneath. That night, I understood what it meant to lose everything in one breath. I lost my mother, and I lost who I was. The funeral was quiet, small, the way my mother would have wanted. A folded flag sat beside her urn, a token for a soldier's mother, though she had never asked for it. Ethan and Paul stood stiff near the pastor, their eyes dry, their faces set like stone. We barely spoke. They looked at me differently now, as if the words my mother had whispered in that hospital room had somehow passed through the walls and reached them. After everyone left, they stayed behind to clean up her house while I went to gather her medical papers for the military benefits file. When I came back, Ethan was sitting at the kitchen table holding a manila envelope. The table looked too small for his broad frame, but he didn't move. Paul stood behind him, silent. The envelope lay open, and inside were my birth certificate, my mother's ID, and a second birth certificate with a different last name. The ink was old, faded, but the year and date matched mine. They looked up at me, and I could see it in their eyes. They had already decided what I was. Not a brother, not family, a stranger who had lived under their roof for decades. I tried to explain that I had only heard the truth the night before she died, but they had already built their version of events. They said I must have known. that I had stayed silent to steal what wasn't mine. They called me a liar, a fraud, a man pretending to belong to a family that had fed and raised him. It didn't matter that my paychecks had helped them when their garages failed, or that I had come home every Christmas without fail. They saw the papers, and that was enough. 2 days later, a call came from my commanding officer. He said there had been an anonymous report questioning my identity. Military protocol required a full background review. Until then, I was placed on administrative leave. I knew exactly who had made the report. Ethan and Paul didn't come to see me, but I saw Ethan's truck parked down the street when I turned in my service weapon and ID badge. The investigation felt like a slow erasure of everything I had built. Every file, every medal, every note of trust, suddenly under a shadow. That afternoon, I walked out of the base for the last time. The guard at the gate gave me a nod, the kind of polite gesture soldiers share when they don't know what else to say. My hands were empty, my name was uncertain. I stood on the side of the road, watching the trucks roll past, hearing the distant echo of drills and orders from the field I could no longer enter. The uniform that once felt like armor now felt like a lie wrapped around my skin. For the first time in my life, I didn't know where home was. For weeks, I lived out of my old Jeep parked behind a closed diner on the edge of town. The engine didn't start some mornings, and the heater only worked if I kicked the dashboard twice. I took night shifts as a security guard at an empty warehouse where nothing ever happened. The building was silent except for the hum of the fluorescent lights and the echo of my footsteps on concrete. Every night, I stared at my reflection in the dusty glass door and wondered who exactly was looking back. The pay barely covered gas and instant coffee, but I told myself it was temporary. I just needed time to think. My uniform was gone, my name was under review, and my family no longer existed. The nights grew longer, and the silence inside my Jeep started to sound like a voice. Sometimes I caught myself talking to my mother, asking why she did it. I never got an answer. One night, I decided to go through the last box of her things. It was an old wooden chest she kept under her bed, the kind that smelled like cedar and old perfume. Inside were folded letters, hospital bills, and a small photo of a toddler in a toy soldier's uniform. The child had my eyes. Beneath the photo was a birth certificate with another name, Michael Lawson. My fingers trembled when I found a half-finished letter, the handwriting shaky but unmistakably hers. It said he will grow up strong like his father, like the general. The rest of the page was blank. I sat there for a long time, the paper shaking in my hands. The rain outside pressed against the windshield, soft and steady. I could feel something breaking open inside me. I wanted to hate her for lying, but part of me knew she must have believed she was saving me from something worse. I opened my phone, typed the words, "Missing Child 1988 General Lawson," and waited. The search results loaded slowly. Then an old newspaper headline appeared on the screen. Military general's son kidnapped from home. There was a grainy black and white photo of a young couple holding a child. The boy's green eyes stared straight into the camera. I felt the air leave my lungs. It was me. Every memory I had, every piece of the life I thought I knew, shifted under me like sand. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't numb. I was awake, and I knew I had to find out who I really was. The warehouse was half-lit that morning, the air heavy with dust and the smell of cold metal. I had just started my shift when I saw two figures walking toward me through the open gate. They didn't belong there. Their posture, the clean lines of their uniforms, the quiet authority in the way they moved it all told me they were military. The taller one introduced himself as Colonel James Holloway, and the woman beside him as Major Elena Brooks. I froze before I even heard what they had come for. They asked if we could talk somewhere private. We stepped into the break room, a narrow space with a flickering light and a pot of coffee that tasted like rust. The colonel placed a folder on the table. He said my name slowly, like testing it. Then he called me by another name, one I had never heard in my life. Michael Lawson. My stomach tightened. He said there had been a DNA match to a missing child from 1988, a case long buried under old files and half-finished reports. The child had been the son of General Raymond Lawson. For a second, everything around me went quiet. I stared at the colonel's mouth moving, but the words didn't register. It felt like being underwater, the sound warped, distant. The name Lawson kept echoing in my head. He explained that Nancy Carter had used an alias when she left the military hospital where she once worked. Her real name was Nancy Lawson, the general's younger sister. She had vanished after a breakdown, following her husband's death. I felt my knees weaken. The coffee mug in my hand rattled against the table. The colonel kept speaking, his tone measured, professional, as if he had said these things before. He said the case had resurfaced when the Department of Defense ran a routine audit of unresolved family-linked disappearances. My file had triggered a match through the DNA sample collected from my mother's hospital belongings after her death. Major Brooks said they had spent months verifying the results. It was undeniable. I was the missing child, the kidnapped son of a man who had spent decades searching. I wanted to tell them they were wrong, that my mother, my aunt, had been a good woman, even if she had lied. But the folder on the table said otherwise. Inside were photographs from the investigation, news clippings, and the same photo I had found online. My hands trembled as I flipped through them. Every page made my chest tighten. I wasn't sure whether to feel anger or grief. I had lost everything once already, but now even my pain had a new name. The colonel said General Lawson was still alive, though barely. He was at a military medical center in Virginia, his condition critical. They had been trying to locate me before it was too late. He wanted to see me. I nodded because I didn't know what else to do. When they left, the warehouse seemed smaller, the air thinner. I sat alone for a long time, the folder still open in front of me. The words inside had rewritten every part of who I was. I was no longer Michael Carter, the man trying to survive disgrace. I was Michael Lawson, the son of a dying general, the nephew of the woman who had stolen me. And somewhere in Virginia, the truth was waiting for me to walk through its door. The drive to Virginia felt longer than any deployment I had ever done. The officers had arranged everything, but my hands still shook when I signed my name at the hospital gate. The medical wing of the base was quiet, filled with the low hum of machines and the faint scent of antiseptic. Every sound seemed amplified, the creak of my boots on the tile, the rhythm of my breath. When I reached the end of the hallway, a nurse stepped aside and nodded toward a half-open door. Inside, a man lay beneath white sheets, his chest rising and falling like a tide barely holding on. General Raymond Lawson looked smaller than I had imagined, but the air in the room still felt heavy with the authority he must have once commanded. His hair was silver, his face thin, but his eyes were sharp. I hesitated in the doorway until he turned his head toward me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence stretched until he whispered my name, the real one, the one he had waited a lifetime to use. I walked closer, my throat tight, my heart pounding hard enough to drown out the machines. He reached for my hand with a grip that still carried strength. He said he had seen my mother's face in mine the moment I stepped in. He told me he had never stopped searching, even when the government declared the case cold. Then his voice grew softer. He said Nancy had been a good sister once, that she had served as a combat nurse overseas and came home carrying wounds no one could see. After her husband died, she drifted between grief and anger. She wanted to be part of the family again, but the distance between them only grew. The day she took me, she had written a letter he never received. She said she was taking back what life had stolen from her. I listened, barely breathing, as he described how the search had consumed everything he loved. His wife had died believing I was gone forever. The house she built had become a museum of loss. He looked at me then, his voice steady even as his breath faltered. He said, "We cannot choose the people who break us, but we can choose what to build from the pieces." He wanted me to promise that I would not waste the life both of them had paid for in different ways. He wanted me to find peace where they could not. Tears blurred the edges of the room. I said I didn't know how to forgive her, or him, or myself. He smiled faintly and said forgiveness was not a gift to others, but a door we open for ourselves. Then the monitor beside him began to slow. He squeezed my hand once, hard enough to make me feel like a child again. His eyes stayed on mine until the sound turned flat and steady. I sat there long after the nurses came and went. The world outside the window glowed with the fading light of evening. For the first time, I felt the weight of two lives pressing against my chest, the man who had lost his son and the woman who had stolen hers. I held his hand until it grew cold, whispering a promise he would never hear. I would turn the pain into something better. I would make sure their mistakes meant something. The will was short, written in a clear, unshaking hand. Everything my father owned, every property and investment, now belonged to me. I stared at the papers for a long time before signing. The lawyers spoke about numbers I couldn't comprehend, assets that felt more like ghosts than gifts. The estate was quiet, too large for one person, filled with photographs of people I was supposed to know but didn't. For weeks, I wandered the halls and thought about what he had said before he died, about building something from the pieces. It came to me slowly, like a memory I hadn't lived yet. I decided to create the Lawson Foundation, a place that would give scholarships to children of soldiers lost in service and provide support for wounded veterans who had nowhere else to go. It felt like a way to keep both of them alive, the father who searched for me and the woman who raised me. I spent long hours meeting with veterans, listening to stories that sounded too much like my own. Men who had come home to nothing, kids who felt forgotten by the world. Every face reminded me of who I could have become if life had gone differently. When the first center opened, I drove out to the small town where Nancy was buried. The grass around her grave had grown tall, and her name was half faded on the stone. I brought flowers, the kind she used to keep on the kitchen windowsill, white lilies mixed with wild daisies. I stood there for a long time, not sure what to say. I told her I forgave her, that even though she had taken everything from me, she had also given me something no one else could. She had taught me how to survive when the world turned cold. The wind moved through the trees, soft and restless. I felt lighter walking back to the car, like I had finally set something down. I looked back one last time and realized that family wasn't about who raised you or who you came from. It was about the people who shaped you, the ones who left marks on your soul, even when those marks came from pain. For the first time in my life, I knew what peace felt like, and it wasn't silence. It was purpose. A year later, I stood behind a wooden podium in front of a crowd of veterans, families, and students wearing fresh uniforms. The sun hung high over the new Lawson Academy, its flag rippling in the late summer wind. The building behind me shimmered with glass and steel, but what mattered most were the people inside, kids who had lost parents to service, men and women learning to live again. My voice trembled when I began to speak. I told them I had once believed life was built on bloodlines, that your worth came from where you were born. But I had learned that family is not a name. It is the people who stand beside you when everything else falls apart. I spoke about Nancy and the father I barely knew, how both had taught me different kinds of strength. One showed me resilience through love twisted by fear, and the other showed me honor through loss and forgiveness. I said the academy was not just a school but a promise that every person who walked through its doors would find belonging, no matter where they came from. The crowd was silent when I finished, the kind of silence that carries respect rather than absence. As I stepped down from the podium, I saw two familiar faces near the back. Ethan and Paul stood together, older, quieter, both in simple jackets and pressed shirts. For a second, I thought I was imagining them. Then Ethan gave a small nod, and Paul's eyes glistened with something that looked a lot like regret. I walked toward them, unsure what to say, until Ethan extended his hand. It was rough and firm, just like our fathers had been. The handshake said what words could not. We were not the same, but we were no longer enemies. When the ceremony ended, I stood outside watching the flag wave above the academy. The wind carried the sound of laughter from the courtyard, students testing their new voices in a place built from the wreckage of my past. I thought about how easy it would have been to carry bitterness, to let the lies define me. But standing there, I realized I had chosen something different. I chose to build. I chose to forgive. I chose to live a life that turned brokenness into light. The flag kept moving above me, steady and strong, and for the first time, I felt like I belonged to the world again.